YouTube and you can look at the video and you will see it's an anecdote which I have told, exactly as he told it to me. I do accept Brian's point that the hospital was incorrect, and I'm happy to apologise for that. But it was an anecdote. But I didn't start following the issues of the NHS in England because of the referendum. I started following them in 2011 because I couldn't believe what they were talking about, that they were even thinking of doing. And the reason I spoke out starting in February was because we were getting no coverage up here at all. Not in our newspapers, our televisions, or our radios. And I felt it was something that people needed to be aware of before we make our decision in a few weeks' time. Because what we are deciding is whether we recommit to be ruled by Westminster, where governments seem to believe in the relentless move of public resources into private hands. Now, since devolution, we got rid of Mrs. Thatcher's trusts and went back to being a single Scottish unified public health service, which we've actually been since 1948. There never has been a British NHS. We've always you wouldn't have noticed that, because we worked as if we were one. But that changed when she introduced her trust system. Now, we got rid of that, and we work across Scotland collaboratively. But what's been happening in the last year and a half in England is that it's being broken up and franchised out. GP commissioners need to put all health service contracts out to tender between the NHS and private companies. And in that first year, 70% of them have been won by private firms like Virgin and Atos. They have a tendency to pick off the easy stuff, the community hospital, the GP, the elective surgery on fit people. And that has meant the NHS hospitals in England have been left dealing with the more complex, the more chronically ill, the more expensive. And at the end of just 1 year, more than 40% of all hospital trusts in England were in debt and needed bailed out by the government. Now, there's been a lot of hand-wringing around that. And obviously Jackson talked about the extra funding. Well, some of that funding was the bailout that went to the hospitals. But what you're starting to get, not yet from politicians, but from think tanks, the King's Fund, Reform UK, is talking about charges. They're talking about charges ranging from £5 to £25 to either go to your GP or to go to A&E. And a survey of NHS leaders published by the Nuffield Trust showed that 50% of them believe that charges are inevitable within the next 10 years in NHS England. Now, I've heard people who are better off saying, well, I would pay £10 to save the NHS. I would pay £25 to save the NHS. I'm sorry, if you are paying to go and see a doctor, you haven't saved the NHS. The NHS is dead. The 66-year experiment in free healthcare at the point of need would be over. Now, the excuse given for all of this upheaval south of the border is that it's to decrease costs and increase efficiency. Now, it obviously hasn't worked terribly well on the decreasing costs idea, because the year before the changes, the NHS actually managed to balance its budget, whereas in the first year of these changes, it's millions in the red. But you can look up on the internet a report by a group called the Commonwealth Fund. Now, it's nothing to do with the Games. It's a US think tank that compares the American system with other Western health services. And they do it every few years. And they just published their 2014 report a couple of months ago. It's based on data from 2011 to 2013, so before these changes came in. And the UK approach of tax in and free healthcare out came out #1. We were top overall. We were first in 8 out of 11 parameters. That included things like quality, safety, efficiency, patient access, patient-centred care. and we were second cheapest. Of all the developed health services in the world, we were second cheapest. So what's the excuse for all the upheaval down south in the middle of austerity when it has cost more? And what we see is that this is basically ideology. This is driving towards Mrs. Thatcher's ideal that everything should be run as a market. Now there's quite a dry thing coming round the corner that you may have read about that is likely to accelerate that. And it's called TTIP. It's a free trade agreement between Europe and America, which will allow US companies into any aspect of Europe that is run as a market. And the NHS in England is now a market. Now, other governments have looked to exempt some of their industries and some of their public services. But Westminster haven't asked for an exemption. And you have to wonder why. Well, if you're trying to move people towards that goal of taking responsibility for your own health, paying for private health insurance, then the quickest way to do that is to bring in companies that do it in their sleep. Now, there's currently a march from Yarrow to London protesting against TTIP and protesting against the privatisation. And I felt that we need to know that. We need to realise how drastic it is south of the border. Labour MPs Michael Meacher and Andy Burnham are jumping up and down, talking about the introduction of charges, the movement towards an American-style system. Andy Burnham describes the NHS as on a cliff edge, and if it isn't saved, it will be gone in 5 years. And yet when I say these things up here, before we make this momentous decision, it's scaremongering and lying. Now, how does it affect us? Because we are devolved. And that's the only reply. It's devolved. Don't worry your pretty little heads about it. Nothing can ever, 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 ever happen to it in perpetuity. Now, that's just ridiculous. We do not control our economy. We do not make the choices about funding. We do not decide what not to spend money on. We don't have the freedom to say we're not paying a share of the replacement for Trident. We didn't have the choice to say we're not invading Iraq. We have to grant has gone down by 7% since 2010 and is earmarked to fall further to -16% by 2017. The Barnett formula that is used to work out our share has a big target painted on its back. And it is likely that what we'll be told to do with these minimal income tax powers we might get, if they can be bothered talking about Scotland for yet another period of time, is you want free prescriptions, you raise your taxes. You want free personal care, you raise your taxes. And to me, the most important thing is simply that currently Westminster control our purse strings. Now, I'm not talking about next year or the year after. What you'll see if you watch that speech that I'm being attacked about is I'm talking about 10 years from now, when citizens in England have nothing. They already still pay for their prescriptions. Their children pay for tuition. And if they're paying for healthcare, I do not believe it's realistic to think they will send a big pot of money up to Scotland so that we have free prescriptions, dental checks, eye checks, personal care, tuition, and a free NHS. That just isn't realistic. I wouldn't like you to think that I believe the NHS in Scotland doesn't have any problems or is remotely perfect. It isn't. And we face a lot of challenges. But our biggest challenge is our poor general health. You hear us described all the time as the sick man of Europe. And we cannot change that unless we can tackle the poverty that blights lives. In Westminster, we hear talk of these people are wasters, we need to get rid of benefits. They can just be put out in exile somewhere and they'll disappear. But we don't have anywhere to exile them. We pay for that failure. We pay benefits. We use police. We pay for prisons. We pay for addiction services. If we had control of our economy and our money, we could make the decision to take all the money we spend on failure and invest it in the child in the first place. That's what I would like to see. David Cameron when he says the two of the greatest things Britain ever achieved were the welfare state and the NHS. And I agree with Brian in that too. But it wouldn't be us that would be leaving those ideals. We want independence so we can keep those ideals. It is Westminster that is destroying the welfare state. It's Westminster that's privatising the NHS, and it's Westminster that's got rid of free education for their own children. To me, those three things are really, really important. And if you believe they're really important to you, I think you should vote yes, we should vote for our own independence and protect the values that we hold by taking control of our own future.
Thank you to our speakers. I would remind you that none of the speakers asked to come here tonight. They were invited here to present